The last train of the day had come and gone, leaving behind only the mournful cry of the wind and a woman whose hope was freezing to the platform planks. Anya clutched a worn, woolen shawl around her shoulders, a flimsy shield against the biting cold of a place she was supposed to call home. The letter in her pocket, crisp with promises of a new life, a husband, and a hearth, felt like a cruel joke written on paper-thin ice. He was not here. The station, a lonely wooden sentinel against a vast, snow-dusted wilderness, was emptying, its windows dimming one by one like dying stars. She was an extraneous piece of luggage, left behind and unclaimed. Anya's people had been called wanderers, marked by the darkness of their hair and the strange lilt in their tongue, and she had spent her entire life trying to find a place to stand still. This was meant to be that place. Instead, it was just another platform from which she would be pushed away. A tear, hot with shame and cold with fear, escaped her eye and traced a path of ice down her cheek. She was left to die alone at the train station, a mail-order bride with no one to receive her. As a sob caught in her throat, a tiny, mittened hand slipped into her own. Anya looked down into the wide, curious eyes of a little girl, no older than 5, her face framed by a fur-lined hood. The child looked at the tear on Anya's cheek, then up at her face, her expression one of profound, innocent seriousness. Then, in a voice as soft as falling snow, the little girl whispered a question that shattered the frozen silence of Anya's despair. "Can you be my mommy?" The question hung in the frigid air, a fragile puff of white vapor that seemed to hold all the warmth in the world. Before Anya could form a response, a tall figure emerged from the station's shadows, his form broad and imposing. This was Sterling, a man carved from the surrounding mountains, his face a landscape of quiet grief and stark lines. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on his daughter with a severity that made Anya flinch. "Maeve," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. Come away from the woman, but Maeve did not let go of Anya's hand. She held on tighter, looking up at her father with a defiant hope that seemed utterly out of place on her small face. The station master, a harried man eager to close up and escape the coming blizzard, saw an opportunity. "Sterling," he called out, his tone a mixture of pity and impatience. "The lady's intended," he didn't show. "She has nowhere to go. The storm will be on us in an hour. You can't just leave her." Sterling's jaw tensed. The entire town knew of his self-imposed isolation, his fierce protection of the solitude he shared with his daughter since his wife's passing. He built walls to keep the world out, and now the world was being pushed into his arms. He looked from the station master's pleading face to Anya's desperate one, and finally to his daughter, who was still clinging to this stranger as if she were a lifeline. He saw the faint, hopeful tremor in Maeve's grip, a longing so powerful it was a physical force. With a deep, reluctant sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire past, he gave a curt nod. "One night," he stated, the words clipped and cold. Until the storm passes, the journey to his remote cabin was a study in silence, broken only by the crunch of snow under the horses' hooves and the howling of the wind, a lonely sound that echoed the hollowness inside them all. The cabin was small, built of sturdy logs chinked with mud and moss, a fortress against the wilderness and the memories that haunted it. A single stone fireplace provided a flickering, meager warmth that did little to dispel the chill Anya felt deep in her bones. She sat on a small stool by the hearth, an intruder in this temple of grief. Every object seemed to hold a story she was not a part of, a half-finished piece of knitting in a basket, a small, carved bird on the mantelpiece, the faint scent of lavender and wood smoke that clung to the air. Sterling moved with a grim efficiency, stoking the fire and preparing a simple meal of broth and hard bread, his movements economical and devoid of any welcome. He did not speak to her, and his silence was a wall far more formidable than the logs of the cabin. Maeve, however, was a bridge across the chasm of quiet. She brought Anya a small, threadbare doll, placing it gently in her lap. "Her name is Willow," the girl whispered, as if sharing a sacred secret. "She's lonely." Anya's heart ached with a pain so sharp it was almost sweet. She understood Willow. As the blizzard raged outside, its fury a physical manifestation of the turmoil within, Maeve began to cough. At first, it was a small, dry sound, but as the hours crept by, it deepened, becoming a ragged, chest-rattling spasm. Her small face grew flushed, her brow slick with a feverish sweat. Sterling's stoic composure finally cracked. He pressed his rough hand to his daughter's forehead, and a raw, primal fear entered his eyes, a terror that Anya recognized instantly. It was the fear of being helpless against a force you could not fight, the fear of losing the one thing that gave your life meaning. Sterling's panic was a palpable thing, a wild energy that filled the small cabin. He paced the floorboards, his shadow dancing like a caged beast in the firelight, his gaze constantly returning to the small, feverish form of his daughter. "The doctor is in town," he muttered, more to himself than to Anya. "A day's ride, if the path is clear," but the path was not clear. The world outside was a churning vortex of white, a monstrous, howling entity that had swallowed the mountains whole. To venture into it would be suicide. He was trapped, just as he had been 2 winters ago. The memory rose like bile in his throat, the image of his wife, Brenna, her breath growing shallow in this very same bed, her life extinguished by a fire in her lungs that he could not put out. Anya watched him, her own fear for the child mingling with a rising sense of purpose. She recognized this fever, the sound of the cough, the specific heat radiating from the child's small chest. In the village where she was raised, her grandmother had been a healer, a woman who understood the language of roots and leaves. They called her wise, until a sickness came that she could not cure, and then they called her a witch and drove her family out. Anya had her knowledge, a legacy of scorned wisdom. She stood up, her movement so sudden it made Sterling flinch. "There are herbs," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "In the lee of the black rocks, by the creek. Silverleaf and lungwort. They can break a fever like this." Sterling stared at her, his eyes narrowed with suspicion and raw grief. "Folk remedies? I'll not have my daughter subjected to your superstitions." Anya met his gaze, her own eyes filled not with fear of his anger, but with a fierce, unwavering resolve. "And I will not watch a child die when I know how to help." Her words hung in the air, a direct challenge to his despair. He saw no deceit in her eyes, only a desperate sincerity that mirrored his own. He was a man drowning, and she was offering a hand, even if he did not trust it. The battle within him was fierce, his ingrained distrust of outsiders warring with the primal terror of losing his child. Finally, the father won. He gave a single, jerky nod. Anya pulled her thin shawl tighter, took the lantern from its hook, and plunged into the screaming blizzard. The wind tore at her, a physical assault that stole her breath and plastered her clothes to her skin with ice. Snow blinded her, a disorienting swirl of white that erased the world. But she held the image of the black rocks in her mind, a landmark Sterling had pointed out on their silent journey. She fought for every step, her body screaming in protest against the cold, driven by the memory of Maeve's labored breathing. She was no longer just an abandoned bride, she was a woman with a mission, a protector. After what felt like an eternity, she found them, the distinctive, silvery leaves of the plants, dusted with snow but still potent. She gathered them with numb fingers, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and fought her way back to the faint, golden light of the cabin. She burst back inside, a whirlwind of snow and frigid air, and immediately set to work, crushing the herbs and steeping them in boiling water. The air filled with a sharp, medicinal scent. Sterling watched her every move, his skepticism having given way to a fragile, desperate hope. Anya gently lifted Maeve's head, coaxing the warm, bitter liquid past her lips, whispering soft words of comfort in her own native tongue. Then, there was nothing left to do but wait. They sat in silence on opposite sides of the hearth, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howling of the storm, a storm that now seemed less a monster and more a guardian, sealing them together in this crucible of fear and hope. For hours, they kept their vigil, their world shrinking to the small cot where Maeve tossed and turned in her feverish sleep. Anya periodically bathed the child's face with a cool, damp cloth, her touch gentle and sure. Sterling watched her, his expression unreadable, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. He saw not a stranger, but a woman acting with the fierce, instinctual love of a mother. She did not flinch from the task, did not complain of a cold or her own exhaustion. Her focus was absolute. Sometime before dawn, a change occurred. The ragged, shallow breaths of the child began to deepen, to even out. The violent flush on her cheeks receded, and the unnatural heat that radiated from her small body began to subside. A fine sheen of sweat broke on her brow, and with a soft sigh, Maeve fell into a true, peaceful sleep. The fever had broken. Anya sagged with relief, her body finally acknowledging the bone-deep weariness that had settled in. Sterling let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for hours, a ragged, shuddering sound that was almost a sob. The formidable walls around his heart, built of grief and solitude, began to crumble. He looked at Anya, her face pale in the firelight, and saw not the outsider he had reluctantly sheltered, but the woman who had walked through a blizzard to save his daughter. "My wife," he began, his voice rough with unshed tears and disuse. "Her name was Brenna. She died of a sickness just like this. In this very room. The doctor said there was nothing to be done." The confession, wrested from the depths of his long-held silence, filled the space between them. He spoke of Brenna's laughter, of the way she had filled this small cabin with a light that had been extinguished the moment she was gone. He spoke of the town's whispers, the pitying looks that felt more like accusations, blaming him for living so far from help, for choosing a life in the wilderness that had ultimately cost her everything. His grief had turned to guilt, and his guilt had calcified into a bitter isolation. He had locked himself away with his daughter, determined to protect her from a world he no longer trusted, a world that had taken everything from him. Anya listened, not with pity, but with a profound and sorrowful understanding. She saw his pain as a reflection of her own, a different shape but the same raw material. When he finally fell silent, his story laid bare between them, she found her own voice. "I am an orphan," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "My parents died of a fever when I was a girl. My grandmother raised me, but her ways were not the town's ways. They called her knowledge witchcraft." She told him of a life lived on the margins, of being perpetually rootless, of the constant whispers that followed her family, branding them as outsiders, as something less. The marriage contract had not been a romantic dream, but a desperate gamble for a place to belong, a chance to finally put down roots in solid ground. "To be rejected before you are even known," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "It is a special kind of loneliness." Sterling looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the resilience forged in the fires of prejudice, the strength born from a lifetime of being cast aside. In their shared stories of loss and societal rejection, they found a startling, powerful common ground. They were two outcasts, adrift in a world that had no place for them, who had found an unlikely harbor in a remote cabin during a blizzard. The blizzard passed, and with the melting snows of spring came a fragile, tentative peace. Anya stayed. It was never discussed, simply understood. She mended their clothes, her stitches small and neat, weaving herself into the fabric of their lives. She planted a small garden with seeds she'd carried in her pocket, coaxing life from the cold soil. She taught Maeve songs in her native language, and the sound of the child's laughter became a regular music in the once silent cabin. Anya and Sterling moved around each other in a quiet rhythm, a dance of unspoken understanding. The chasm of silence had been bridged by shared vulnerability, and in its place grew a tender respect. One bright, clear afternoon, Maeve was playing near the edge of the woods, her laughter echoing in the clean spring air as she chased a butterfly. Anya was hanging laundry on a line, humming softly, when a flicker of movement in the trees caught her eye. It was not a deer. A lean, grey wolf, its ribs showing after a long, hard winter, had emerged from the forest, its yellow eyes fixed on the small, unsuspecting child. A primal coldness, colder than any blizzard, seized Anya. There was no time to think, no time to call for help. With a cry that was torn from her soul, she ran, placing her own body between the predator and Maeve. She grabbed a thick branch from the ground, her knuckles white, her stance wide and defiant. She was a mother protecting her young, a she-bear woken from slumber, and she would die here before she let any harm come to this child. The wolf snarled, lowering its head, and for a heart-stopping second, the world stood still. Then, the sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the air, and the wolf crumpled to the ground. Sterling stood on the cabin porch, his rifle still raised, his face a mask of shock and dawning realization. He lowered the rifle slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs not from the danger, but from what he had just witnessed. He had not seen a desperate stranger or a temporary houseguest. He had seen a warrior, a guardian, a woman who had, without a flicker of hesitation, offered up her life for his child. The depth of that instinctive, ferocious love struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had thought his heart was a buried thing, interred with Brenna beneath the cold earth. But watching Anya gather a trembling Maeve into her arms, stroking her hair and whispering reassurances, he felt something stir within him, a painful, hopeful thawing. That evening, the mood in the cabin was subdued. The weight of what could have happened settled heavily upon them. After Maeve was safely tucked into her bed, Anya sat by the fire, her hands not idle for once, but resting in her lap. Sterling came and sat near her, not across the hearth, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. He picked up a piece of wood, turning it over and over in his calloused hands, searching for words that had been foreign to him for years. "When Brenna died," he said at last, his voice thick with emotion, "I thought that part of my life was over. The part that feels. I thought my only job was to keep Maeve safe. To build the walls high enough." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and stripped of all pretense. "But you didn't just keep her safe. You brought her back to life. You brought me back." He reached out, his hand covering hers. It was the first time they had touched since that first night. His touch was not one of passion, but of profound, aching gratitude and something deeper, something more vulnerable. "Anya," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "Don't just stay until the storm passes. Stay forever. Be my wife. Be her mother." Tears welled in Anya's eyes, but these were not the cold, desperate tears she had shed at the train station. These were tears of homecoming. She had spent a lifetime searching for a place, a person, a reason to stop wandering. And here, in the heart of the wilderness, with a man who spoke in silences and a child who had seen her soul, she had found it. Her quiet yes was lost in the crackle of the fire, but he heard it in the way she turned her hand to clasp his, in the brilliant, watery light of her smile. The years that followed were etched not in hardship, but in quiet joy. The cabin grew, a new room added on, its windows bright with curtains Anya had sewn. Her small garden expanded into a thriving plot that fed them through the seasons. The solitary homestead slowly transformed into a home, filled with the scent of baking bread and the sound of two children's laughter. 2 years after Anya's arrival, a son was born, a boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's dark, soulful eyes. Maeve, now a confident and loving older sister, would sit with him in the summer grass, showing him how to make dandelion crowns, her earlier loneliness a forgotten ghost. Sterling was a changed man. The harsh lines of grief on his face had softened, replaced by a gentle contentment. He still spoke few words, but his actions spoke volumes, in the way he would bring Anya a wildflower from the woods, the way his hand would find the small of her back as they stood on the porch at dusk, watching their children play. They were a family, forged not of contract or convenience, but of shared wounds and fierce, unconditional love. They had found their place, not on a map, but in each other. They were no longer the outcasts, but the unshakable center of their own small, perfect world. We have just witnessed a story about the profound truth that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build. It's a testament to the idea that the deepest connections are often forged in the fires of adversity, and that a home is not a place, but a feeling of being truly seen and unconditionally loved. Anya, Sterling, and Maeve show us that even after the most devastating losses and the most painful rejections, the human heart has an infinite capacity to heal, to love again, and to create a place of belonging where there was none before. Their journey reminds us that sometimes, the greatest courage is not in facing down a storm or a predator, but in daring to let someone past the walls we've built around our hearts. If their story of resilience and found family moved you, if it made you believe in the power of a second chance, then you have found a home here with us at the Hopeful Heart. We are dedicated to bringing you tales that uplift the spirit and reaffirm the strength and beauty of human connection. To ensure you don't miss another story that can bring a little more light into your day, please subscribe to our channel. Click that notification bell so you are always the first to know when a new story is released. And if this tale resonated with you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that even in the coldest of winters, the warmth of love can find a way to bloom. Thank you for watching, and for being a part of our community.